If we could just pop over to the next slide, Lucy, that'd be great. We're going to divide this content amongst a few of us. I'll just give a quick reminder of our mission, and then we'll just go around and introduce ourselves, particularly those of us who'll be working on this supportive home grant round over the next few years. I'll say a few brief words on our approach to evaluation. I will keep it brief because we'll do much more on that once we get into the projects later on in the year. And then really the substance of the session that we'll try and get into as quickly as we can is just to go into a bit more detail about the projects that we're proposing to fund, as well as a Q&A about those. And then Lucy and I will close with a few words on next steps. And this is just a reminder to me to say, for those who are joining, that we're recording the session, so do feel free to drop your video if you'd prefer. So hopefully this is familiar to most people. We're a 10-year fund founded in 2019 with an endowment from the Home Office. We're one of the UK government's What Works centres, but also with an ambition to ensure that knowledge is used in practice. And we've got working in partnership as a core value that we strive to adhere to. We're here to prevent children and young people becoming involved in violence, and we'll do that by finding out what works and building a movement to put that knowledge into practice. So if we just keep going, thanks very much. This is a diagram of our strategy. I won't go through this in lots of detail. There's some really nice content on all of this in our website, but I guess I just wanted to orient us a little bit to where this fund sits within our wider strategy. So you can see there's three pillars here. We will fund good work, we will find out what works, and we'll work for change. And really where we are here is within one of our priority themes, the supportive home grant round, and evaluating the good ideas that I think we've shortlisted. So if we keep going. What I might propose, if it's all right with colleagues who are here, we have, I think, like quite a lot of London organisations, been a bit COVID hit this week and over recent weeks. So there's a few fewer of us than we're expecting. So I might just ask those of us who are here just to quickly introduce ourselves, and I'll just do the rest of the colleagues that aren't here. Ali, you happy just to say a quick hello?
Hi, I'm Ali McFarlane. I'm a Senior Evaluation Manager at YEF.
And Amy's another one of our senior evaluation managers, and Chanel's one of our evaluation managers who will be managing two of the projects within this portfolio of work. Emma's another one of our evaluation managers, and Freya works as an evaluation manager specifically on our place-based programme of work. So some of you who are involved in that work might have gotten to know Freya over the last year or so. Jackie is the lead on that programme of work, our place-based work. Jackie is the head of that programme of work. Lara is another one of our senior evaluation managers who is currently on maternity leave. Lucy, over to you.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm another of the senior evaluation managers, and I'm leading on the evaluation side of things for Grant Round 2. So really pleased to see all of you.
Molly is our head of targeted projects and evaluations, so managing primarily projects that we work alongside other funders on. Sabrina, over to you.
Hey everyone, I'm Sabrina and I'm one of the evaluation managers, and I have a couple of launch grant round evaluations that I manage, and happy to see you all today.
Great. And last but by no means least, Susan is another one of our evaluation managers who will be managing at least one project within this programme of work. Just thought helpful for you to get a sense of who we are, particularly those of you who'll end up working with us over the next few years. So we're the evaluation team, sort of sat alongside us. Equally important team within YEF is the programmes team, who manage the relationship with the project or the intervention delivery team. So it's quite strong. We aim for quite a strong working relationship between those four parties: the intervention delivery team, the evaluation teams, the programme managers within YEF, as well as the evaluation team. Next slide, please, Lisa. So I'll just say a few words on our approach to evaluation, but we'll keep this fairly brief. So if we just move on to the next slide, we have a staged approach to evaluation that I suspect many of you will be familiar with. So this is the Early Intervention Foundation's 10 steps to evaluation success, and this is heavily informed the YEF's approach to evaluation. The EIF, some of you might know, was one of the founding partners of the Youth Endowment Fund. And this is really trying to get at the idea of, you could think of the purpose of YEF in one sense as being to try and take as many projects as we can to step 10, where we know that they're effective and they're being effectively delivered at scale. I guess what we know from quite a lot of policy areas is that's quite challenging to achieve and takes a long time. And so the purpose of this guide is to articulate a set of concrete steps that we can work through with projects and evaluators to build the evidence base for particular projects. And you'll see on the next slide that we've got guidance that underpins the majority of these steps to describe sort of our expectations of what the purpose of the different evaluation steps are, and the principles that we'd like to sort of get consistently implemented across each of the evaluations. I'd really recommend that, particularly those of you who are going on to look at to develop full proposals here, do take a look at this guidance, especially as you're working through those proposals. But we will go into the content of these in more detail in a second session in the next phase of the commissioning process. Next slide, please, Lisa. Great. Particularly for people who might be joining YEF recently, I wanted just to, before I hand over to Lucy, say a few words on what I think are the main differences between YEF's funding as one of the What Works centres and some of the other types of research funding that you might be familiar with. I've deliberately painted this in quite primary colours, so I wouldn't worry too much if you've got questions about some of this characterisation. I hope it's still useful in just trying to get some clarity in what the main differences are. So if we sort of compare YEF to some of the main research councils like NIHR, ESRC and MRC on the one hand, and then the What Works centres like the Youth Endowment Fund, the Education Endowment Foundation and the What Works Centre for Children's Social Care. I think if any of you are familiar with working with some of those other What Works centres, what I'm about to say, I think sort of what won't be new. So in terms of the status, many of the research councils are government agencies with annual agreed budgets. We are an independent charity sat outside of that system with an endowment over a fixed period of 10 years. Most, but I appreciate not all of the research councils operate on the principles of full economic costing and typically are only focused on research costs, not intervention delivery costs. In common with our sort of sister What Works centres, we are mandated to fund both intervention and evaluation costs. That's one of the reasons why for us full economic costing I think just isn't possible, and what we are really trying to focus on is those direct project costs and the minimum amount of overheads needed in order to make the project viable. In terms of the commissioning model then, I think if we, particularly as we've started to learn a bit more about the NIHR, exploring a potential collaboration in this round. One of the things that really strikes us is just how intense the upfront assessment process is for evaluators. In comparison then, you might say there's quite a lot of autonomy post-award for evaluation teams to make their own methodological choices. The way I'd say that compares to YEF's approach is, again, I think the assessment and the upfront period is reasonably intense. That's followed by this co-design phase where we work alongside the intervention delivery team and evaluators, but then we stay involved throughout the rest of the project, sort of to make sure that we're maintaining consistency in the implementation of our evaluations across each of our rounds. So following on from that, then I think largely people might be used to methodological choices totally being delegated to them in research council funding and being highly project specific. I would say we're really just trying to balance that. We're really keen to give evaluators as much sort of choice over methods as we can, but we are trying to balance that with portfolio learning and make sure at the end of our endowment we're able to have a set of messages and learning that's consistent and that adds up to more than the sum of its parts. And so some of the methodological choices in the evaluations will be driven by the principles set out in our guidance. If we just go on to the next one, Lisa. So here the distinction that I thought would just be useful to get at, I guess here I'm really thinking of notions like service evaluation, I think within the NHS, where really what we're doing is just evaluating things exactly as they are and trying to not be disruptive through the evaluation process and avoid making changes to the intervention. I think the YEF approach is quite different. We wouldn't usually be randomizing young people in service delivery. And so our expectation really is that through the co-design process, quite fundamental things might be changing about the intervention in order to accommodate the most robust evaluation that we think is possible. And so that's another difference, I think, that I would just draw your attention to. As with many funders, really keen that we're incentivising open and reproducible science. I think that really varies between different research councils and funders. We're doing four main things, I think. So the first is protocols get published in advance, which I think will be familiar to many of you. The trials that we commission will also be pre-registered. For our impact studies, but not studies further down the 10 steps that are presented, a statistical analysis protocol will be produced. That will be peer reviewed and published alongside the protocol. And then both, I think, usually at an interim phase in the project, usually after the first year. And again, then at the end of the project, we'll have a report that's peer reviewed alongside that protocol and the statistical analysis plan. And again, I think that will feel familiar to many of you who've worked with other What Works centres. So just finally on here, just wanted to say a word about publications, particularly for those of you in the academic community. One of the main outputs, not the only one, will be academic publications. And I think that'll be a real priority through Research Council funding. We're really keen that academic publications come out of our research work, but in common with all our other sister What Works centres, we evaluators commit to publishing the YEF report first in accordance with the principles that we've set out in our reporting policy that I'd encourage you to have a look at, and then absolutely fine that academic publications come after that. Okay, Lisa, just final slide from me. This is just me going into a little bit more detail about the distinction that I made in the two concepts of the evaluation. I think this is really exciting, by the way. So if we look at sort of model one, before I joined YEF, this was I'd say characterised the majority of the evaluations that I worked on, particularly in government, where I think the projects and evaluations, whether intentional or not, are treated pretty much as separate elements. And in many cases, the project might even have started before the evaluation gets involved. I think there's some really great evaluation work is done sort of within this model, but I think it can create challenges, particularly for doing robust impact evaluation. If we compare that with what we've imaginatively called model two, I think those of you familiar more with the clinical trials world, I think this will feel familiar. We're trying to think of the project as being embedded within the evaluation. These are two equally important elements of an indivisible whole. And this is where we're trying to get to with our evaluations. I'd say this is sort of ongoing work, but we have had sort of real great success in our existing work and sort of keen to work with you over the next few years on this work to really try and make sure we're embedding that sense of the evaluation and the project being as equally important. All right, I might leave it there by way of intro. I'm keen that we sort of push into the introduction of the projects as soon as we can, but I will just pause there and see if people have got burning questions before we get into the specifics of this round of funding. I might ask my YEF colleagues just to help me with the participant list and see if we've got any hands.
No. Oh yeah, Nikki put her hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just unmuting. Hi, I'm Nikki Stanley from UCLAN. I mean, I'm not sure if this is the right point to ask this question, but I know that you want the evaluation team and the project team to spend a lot of time together at the outset, co-producing the evaluation plan. And I'm wondering whether the evaluation contract precedes that stage, and whether the evaluation team is funded for that stage.
Yeah, really important question. Thanks for raising that, Nikki. I will say a little bit more about this later on, but broadly the position is we treat the co-design phase that Lucy will say a little bit more as part of the commissioning process. So another way of saying that would be, although the framework agreement that governs our relationship with you across all of YEF's work will precede that phase, the project evaluation agreement that specifies the way we'll work together on that individual project comes after that co-design phase. Now, having said that, we recognise that this is quite intense work, and many of the outputs that you'll work on with the project will form integral parts of the evaluation going forward. And so the position that we've arrived at is to say, we are in effect asking for the evaluators to make in-kind contributions as part of the commissioning process themselves to attend those meetings. But the work that you would do on things like, for example, the theory of change and the logic model that's going to require your time outside of the meetings, they can be accounted for in the budgets that we get after that process. But we'll say a little bit more about that later on, so do feel free that you can come back if you want to say more about that. Any more questions on this part? If not, I might suggest that we keep going, Lucy.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to giving an overview of themed grant rounds at YEF, which some of you might be familiar with, and then more specifically give a brief introduction to our A Supportive Home grant round, or grant round 2, as we sometimes call it, which is the focus of today. So at YEF, you might know that we arrange our themed funding rounds by a series of themes, which you can see on the slide here. And these are the conditions that we think children and young people need in their lives to keep them safe from becoming involved in violence. And we selected these themes through a process of reviewing research evidence and also engaging with a range of stakeholders, including many people that work in the field directly with young people and through engaging with young people themselves. And so far, we have launched grant rounds in 3 of these themes. So some of you might have been involved in our diversion grant round, or grant round 1. And we've actually very recently launched grant round 3 for projects to apply for that. But the focus of today is grant round 2, which is A Supportive Home. And that's what we've already circulated the evaluation specifications for. So for this grant round, the question we're aiming to answer is which approaches are most effective in helping families and carers to create a supportive home environment for 6 to 14-year-old children, although we do raise the age range up to 18 for looked after children and children with special educational needs, in reducing the likelihood of them becoming involved in violence. So we know that every child needs a supportive home to grow up well, and we believe that a stable and supportive home life will reduce the likelihood of involvement and becoming involved in violence. And we know that there is some evidence for that already, but we're really keen to build this evidence base and understand which of those approaches are most effective through this grant round. And we are just in terms of how we chose the theme for this grant round, we had conversations with a number of stakeholders, which made it clear that we should focus on helping families. We already know that there's some evidence in this space, and we also think there's a really great opportunity to build evidence and improve the evidence base in a UK context specifically for this grant round. And we've also divided programmes into 4 different categories. So the first is parenting programmes, and that will include programmes for foster carers. So these interventions focus on enhancing parenting practices and behaviours. Second is family therapy interventions, and these typically use a form of psychotherapy that focuses on improving interfamilial relationships and the patterns of behaviour of the family as a whole, as well as individuals. The next is parental conflict interventions, and these are specifically designed to improve couple and interparental relationships, and they typically focus on the way couples communicate and engage with each other in managing relationship conflicts. And the last category is domestic abuse interventions, and those are specifically designed to prevent and reduce harm to children and adults. And we're now at the stage where we have shortlisted a number of projects that will go through to the next stage, the co-design phase, which you can see a summary of here. And you'll see that we have included at least 1 project in each of those 4 programme categories. It's worth mentioning that we have shortlisted another project called Solace Women's Aid, which is domestic abuse intervention, but we need to take some development work with the project before it's at the point where we can start evaluation commissioning. So we'll follow up with further information on that. And now I'm going to hand over to, or shortly I will be handing over to a few members of the YEF evaluation team to talk you through them. But just wanted to mention that this is the stage that we're at in the process, commissioning process at the moment. So we've gone through stage 1, which is where we shortlist the projects who applied to the funding round. And now we are at the point of starting to commission evaluators. And then following the appointing evaluators, we'll move on to that co-design phase that we've mentioned already, and we'll follow up with some details on shortly. So far we're at the point where we've shared the evaluation specifications, which hopefully lots of you have already seen. And now I'll hand over to some YEF colleagues who will give a bit more detail on those projects, and we'll also have lots of time for questions from you all. And I'm going to be handing over to Ali, who will talk you through multi-systemic therapy, child abuse and neglect.
Thanks, Lucy. So yes, I'm going to talk through MST-CAN with you. So it's a family therapy intervention. An outline of the project, it works with families where children are at risk of going into a care. So you'll have children on the child protection plan. Families are most likely very well known to the local authority, and they're also likely to be on a second or subsequent child protection plan. It's a very intensive therapeutic intervention, so a therapist works with the whole family for 6 to 9 months. Typically, they might work with up to 5 family members to address underlying issues such as past trauma and substance abuse. So therapy will be focused on maybe individual adult or child focused or family focused, depending on what issues arise in the particular family they're working with. As I said, the target population is families where there's a child on child protection plan. Children and young people will be aged 6 to 17 years, and it's specifically for where there's been physical abuse or neglect. And there needs to have been a new report of abuse or neglect in the last 6 months. The primary outcome we're looking at is reducing behavioural problems in children and young people. Move to the next slide. And our main research question is as follows: is intensive therapeutic support that builds on family strengths to overcome the risks that are contributing to child maltreatment an effective way of improving family relationships, reducing child behavioural problems, and reducing the likelihood that children will go into care? So we're looking at doing a pilot to efficacy study using randomization. There are already 6 local authorities who have MST-CAN teams, 2 of which were in the bid, and there's also some new proposed sites. where local authorities are already delivering MST but are keen to take on MST Can. There hasn't been an RCT of MST Can in the UK, so we're really keen to do an RCT. We've done some indicative sample sizes, and here we've got 196 is the proposed with, and 30 additional children and young people if you account for attrition. Attrition is actually very low in MST Can. I think one of the services data from one of the local authorities actually show completion rates around 90% because it's such an intensive program and problems are often like families are meeting with therapists up to 3 times a week with additional contact outside of that. So retention on and intervention is actually quite high. We're suggesting that the evaluation is 2 years, but I think as we'll go on to talk about through co-design, these are the sorts of things that will be discussed during co-design. Thank you. So some project-specific evaluation considerations. So I interviewed the MST UKI, who are the licensing body with some of the local authority partners in the bid. They're really on board with the idea of doing robust evaluation, which is exciting. They're also really open to an RCT with randomization, but obviously they'll welcome evaluator suggestions on how to achieve randomization. Yeah, there's obviously there's not a sort of obvious business as usual because families they're working with tend to have been through all the support that's on offer in a local authority, and they sort of come to the end of what else is on offer. And obviously the alternative to working with the family therapist is that the child is going to go into care. So there's some work to do, I think, here around what the design of a RCT would look like and what a sort of business as usual alternative might look like. Or the other thing to note is the services say they don't typically operate a wait list because it's quite time sensitive. They take a family when a family's at a critical point and are ready to work with the therapist. So a few things that I think will be quite meaty to work through in co-design. So as I said, challenges that need to be considered as part of co-design are the randomization. Also, families consenting to be part of the evaluation. I think in this intervention, you've obviously got up to 5 family members and typically around 3 children. So family members could be the parents, maybe foster carers, kinship carers, wider family members and network. So I think that's going to be something to work through in co-design. And then finally, the number of sites needed to reach a sample size. As I said, there's a number of sites already delivering MST Can, as well as a number of sites who are ready and wanting to take part in evaluation and take on MST Can. So what were we looking for in a bidder, in an evaluator? So RCT experience. I think also it might be very helpful to have prior experience of evaluation with children and families where children are on the edge of care or very high need. And I think also, given that we'll most likely have a number of local authority partners involved, experience of forming good working partnerships with multiple local authority partners would be beneficial here. So I think that's everything on my slides, and yeah, very happy to take questions.
Thanks so much, Ali. We decided it was probably best to do questions immediately after each project, so I hope people will find that helpful. Just scrolling down.
Question from Jane, I think.
Please, Jane, go for it.
Thanks very much indeed. It's a super helpful introduction. Thank you very much indeed. And the project summaries that you've put together are really helpful as well. I had a couple of questions on this one. One is, you've mentioned in the request for proposals that the programme reporting data that MST gather themselves, would that be available to the evaluation team, or is that something that would be held separately by the programme team and not shared?
I think my understanding, so MST UKI could collect that on their database, but they'll be the sort of lead partner on the project side, working with the evaluator, and then each local authority will appoint somebody to work on the evaluation. And yeah, my understanding is that they would be very happy for that data to be part. Obviously, data sharing agreements will need to be worked out, but yeah, my understanding is they're happy for that data to be included and shared.
Great. I had a second question as well, if I can pop in with that, but
Sure.
thank you, which is about whether the sites that are currently running it, they presumably are using SDQ and SRDS already, are they, the sites that are already running MSTcan?
That is a good question. I can't actually say yes or no. I've seen some information from Leeds where they ran an evaluation which did not include those two measures, included a number of other standardized measures. But we did discuss this at interview, and I think these are core measures that they're willing to use.
Great, thank you.
Jane, can I just check, was what motivated your question the thought that we've already got an evaluation of a different MST variant in the field where they'll have experience of using those tools?
I was more, sorry, excuse my croaking. I was more wanting to get a sense of how much sort of preparatory and supportive work one might need to build in for doing with the sites to support them in using SDQ and SRDS, which don't always come naturally to practice organisations. And I've noted in some of the projects that you've said that teams are already using the outcome measures that you've suggested. So I was just sort of wondering if that was the case here as well. So it was that rather than whether thinking about whether there's already evaluation data.
We might, that's really helpful, Jane, thanks. We might log that one, and I think sort of through our next steps we can get clarity on that, particularly at the point at which teams are moving to develop full proposals. Yeah, it's an important point. Just having a look down to see if there's any more questions on MST before we continue moving through to the next project. Unless any of my YEF colleagues have spotted any, I don't think I can see any more. Ali, I might suggest that you keep going to NSPCC.
Great, yeah, happy to do so. So the next project I'm going to talk to you about is an NSPCC project, Domestic Abuse Recovering Together. So a domestic abuse intervention. So it's a 10-week program. It's for a mother and one child to participate on the program. And it's focused on rebuilding the mother-child relationship. So the 10 weeks, each week is a structured session, and it takes a mother and her child on a journey from understanding, sort of defining domestic abuse, understanding domestic abuse, what the impact on mother and child has been, sort of exploring feelings and emotions and being able to communicate those to each other, dealing with loss and grief, and then looking forward to start to think about healthy relationships, positive communication, and yeah, the world beyond their 10-week program. So the target population, as I said, is a mother and one child, so children aged 7 to 14. Mothers can repeat the program with another child, and they tend to do the program first with the child where there's the greatest need. So it might be because they've been referred from social services in relation to one child, or from a school, but yes, they're welcome to come and repeat the program with their other children. So the mothers previously experienced domestic abuse, but importantly, the abuse is no longer taking place and the abusive partner no longer lives with the family. There's also some other eligibility criteria about the mother being in the right place to come on the program. The primary outcome, again, we're looking at reducing behavioural problems. And the main research question here is supporting mothers who have experienced domestic abuse to learn more about how domestic abuse happens, how it affects children, and strengthen the relationship with their child. An effective way of improving mothers' self-esteem and confidence in parenting and reducing child behaviour problems. So again, we're looking at a pilot to efficacy study using randomisation. The NSPCC have done some previous evaluation themselves internally. These have been QED studies, so we're keen to kind of take a step forward from there. The indicative sample size here is 155 plus 50 for attrition. In discussion with the NSPCC, they didn't have up-to-date data on attrition, but sort of historical data suggested that attrition could be quite high. Hence sort of 50, an additional 50 young people, children and young people there. Again, indicative length of evaluation is 2 years. So some considerations, the NSPCC are really on board with doing an external evaluation here. I'm really keen to work with an external evaluator. They are keen to do robust evaluation with random if possible, but I think, again, we'd welcome evaluator suggestions on how to achieve randomization. And again, there's no sort of obvious business as usual alternative. And I think it's worth noting that NSPCC are quite keen that all mothers and children are offered the intervention. They previously, the QED worked on a wait list, or they have a wait list, sorry, I'd say. But I think so something that would be really important here is reassuring them how randomization could work with this target population. And again, so yeah, sorry, some of the challenges to be considered as part of co-design. So again, number of sites needed to reach the sample size. At the moment, the NSPCC run DART in 30 external delivery partners, so smaller charities, local authorities. But they are proposing for this project that the evaluation will work with some of their NSPCC hubs who will deliver the programme. But there is also the option of including other external delivery partners if needed to reach sample size. They were new to the concept of our data archive, the YEF data archive, so I think be keen to make sure that that's really covered in co-design and that all partners are happy. And the other thing I just wanted to flag here is that the NSPCC do have their own research ethics committee, which for all evaluations that includes their service users. And obviously they won't be the people who are signing off on this evaluation. We would have an external ethics committee as we do on all our projects. But I think I've just flagged them here as I think there'll be a key stakeholder during co-design to have them on board. So next slide. So again, looking for a bidder with RCT experience. And I think because of the target population, it would be great to have an evaluator who's got prior experience of working with women and or children who've experienced domestic abuse. I think really, yeah, being able to reassure NSPCC that you've worked with those populations before would be helpful. So that's all from me, and very happy to take questions.
Thanks, Ali. Just looking down the list again. Nikki, please.
Hi, so this is the evaluation where you've suggested the possibility of an additional application to the NIHR for further funding. To what extent has that been discussed with the NIHR? Because the NIHR have actually funded a feasibility study of a very similar programme, which is ongoing.
Are you happy for me to take this one, Ali?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great question, Nikki. I think the trial that you're referring to might be one, is it the AVA intervention?
That's it.
Yeah, so yeah, we have had a bit of a conversation with them about this, and we benefited from Vashti Berry, one of the authors on that trial being involved in our grants and evaluation committee. And so, you know, in principle, NIHR still keen on this, particularly given their focus on families where domestic abuse is present at the moment. And so broadly, the process that we're intending to follow, that Ali will say a little bit more about later on, is that when we've received expressions of interest on these projects, we'll do another round with NIHR of just checking to see if the two projects that we've identified with them already, the MST CAN that Ali's just described, as well as this intervention, that from the descriptions provided in the expressions of interest, that they still look like they're in sort of core research area focus for NIHR. So we're trying to cover this off, I think, in a few phases, just to make sure that at the point at which, if we're ending up with a team who's keen to go forward in either August or I think the next one would be October to apply for NIHR funding, you know, we're really clear that we've covered off that this is within the research areas that NIHR is interested in funding. I guess, you know, that's important for two reasons, just to make sure that we're making best use of everybody's time, including yours, but just recognising, as I understand from a few of the people that have chatted through this, just how big an investment an NIHR application is, and wanting to make sure that by the point at which you get to that we're really clear that this is within the remit. Does that help, Nikki?
Yeah.
Right. Just having another look down the list.
I think Jane's got a question.
Please, Jane. Sorry, it's taking me a while to see people.
That's okay. I had a follow-on question to Nikki's, which is just if you could sort of explain a bit more about how you would see an NIHR application working within the timelines that you've set out. And also a second question, which applies to several of the projects, which is that sometimes you've specifically said that you want to commission an implementation and process evaluation, and sometimes you use slightly different terminology, and sometimes you haven't mentioned it, but in the research questions, you've got questions that relate to implementation and process evaluations. And I wasn't sure if there was anything to read into that, or whether the implication is that you do actually want an implementation evaluation alongside each of the trials.
Yeah, great question. I would say that accidental differences that it's useful for somebody to have pointed out that we can iron out in the next iteration. So when we're at the phase of commissioning an impact study, it would definitely be right to say that we want to make sure that we've got a real high quality implementation and process evaluation sat alongside that. And Jane, I know you'll know, familiar from this from other work, but keen that draws on many of the same principles of the framework that we've got in our feasibility study guidance, obviously with appropriate modification. Just remind me what the first part of your question was, Jane. I'm a bit worried I've not answered that.
It was just building on Nikki's question about NIHR, and just if you could sort of explain a little bit more about how you would see an NIHR application sitting alongside the timelines for what you'd fund, you know, because their timelines are longer and decision making is a bit slower than on your side on the whole.
Yeah, that's definitely true, I think. So a couple of things on that. I mean, one would be to say, just in case anybody else is worried about this, you know, one evaluator got in touch and just said, but as they understood it, you know, not all of the organisations on our panel are going to be eligible for NIHR funding, and I think that is true. So we will go through our usual processes that Lucy will go on to describe in a moment. So in that sense, the decision about which evaluator we appoint will be done blind to whether they happen to be eligible for NIHR funding, and then we'll explore that with the successful evaluator later on if they are eligible. But the strong advice that we got from the evaluators that we spoke to, just to help us sort of test the practicalities of this, would be in order for an evaluator or an evaluation team to develop an NIHR proposal and the sort of forensic level of detail that's required, they would need to go through our co-design process with the projects first in order to be able to get to that level of detail. So you'll see in the slides that we've got a little bit later on, the proposal would be, we go through our commissioning process, we pair a team or a consortium together with the project, they go through our co-design process, submit the NIHR application, and then we really are sort of committed to going through the NIHR processes and need them to sort of run to their own timeline. And I think that what that means is, if we do decide to go down that route, if we work with a team who's interested in that, we would be running these one or two projects on quite a different timeline to the rest. Does that help, Jane? Great.
Sorry, I was saying yes, thank you.
Just going to have a final look through before we keep going. Sabrina, I think I'm right in saying it's you next. If so, over to you.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to talk you through the application from South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust. We call them SLAM. So the project category is a parental training called Being a Parent, which will be paired with a second part, which is positive leisure and sports for children. So overall, we've got a 10-weekly group session with combined parenting training and the child leisure activities. The target population is specifically Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities, and they have a screening process in place where they look for children who are aged 6 to 11, who show behavior or conduct problems, and in the screening they also use the SDQ already. So the indicative primary outcome would be reducing the behavioral problems in the children. The main research question that we want to address is, in the population of families from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds, does a parenting program based on social learning theory show a greater effect on child externalizing behavior when paired with children's positive leisure and sports activities than business as usual? So you can see that we've got a little comparison in here, which refers to being a parent being an intervention that has been trialed before. Excuse me. And in this developer-led study, which was an RCT, they found effects, and they have an evidence base for being a parent being effective to reduce child externalizing behavior. And what we want to find out now is whether a pairing with a specifically tailored manualized positive leisure and sports program would bring even greater effects. So the business as usual being a parent alone. I hope that's clear. Otherwise, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A afterwards. So because there is existing evidence and there have been studies before, we are planning to start off with an internal pilot following an efficacy using randomization. And we calculated an indicative sample size of 206. In the developer-led study, we could see that the attrition rate is about 15%. So we said we would want 30 people in case there is attrition. And the length of the evaluation is indicated at 2 years. Yeah, so project-specific evaluation considerations. Firstly, this is an NHS trust, so we might need NHS ethics approval. This is likely but still needs to be confirmed. And then we could also consider a 3-arm trial due to the fact that we've got being a parent paired with positive leisure and sports. We have being a parent alone, and we could also explore what business as usual would look like if it's not being a parent. This is still open. And a couple of challenges that we need to consider as part of co-design is firstly, really dig into the positive leisure and sports component to make sure that this component is integral part of the logic model, that it's theory-based in the first place, and to really flesh out how positive leisure and sports is supposed to contribute to the intervention. And the second thing is, I just mentioned the indicated length of delivery at 2 years. So in the application, they've said that they would like to have funding for 3 years, but after doing a couple of back and forward calculations, we said that this could be feasible in 2 years. So we need to explore during co-design whether we can get to the sample size that we need within 2 years. Right, and at last, what are we looking for from bidders? So firstly, RCT expertise, because we are going to conduct an efficacy study with randomization. Secondly, it would be very much desirable to have evaluators on this project who have experience working with a majority Black, Asian, and minority ethnic population, and generally experience in evaluating family programs. Family trainings would be desirable as well. Then we would ask for willingness to use our core measurement, which in this case would be the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, and not so much the SRDS, because it doesn't apply here in this specific project. And then we would need excellent knowledge on what makes a good standardized measure for parenting outcomes, and a track record of forming good working relationships with project teams and their partners, especially on this project because there are 3 partners for the positive leisure and sports bit, because they are going to implement these projects, these programs in 3 different areas. So there will be partnership work required. Yeah, now happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. I'll look down the list as well, but maybe we can do it together.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, Elena.
Hi, yeah. Is it possible that we could have a look, or you would be able to share with us the previous evaluation that was done, just so we can see sort of what their assumptions were? Just be quite helpful to see what they did.
Yes, of course. Maybe would it help if I just put a link in the chat? I think it's accessible. I just need a second to bring this up.
Yeah, I wouldn't feel under any pressure to sort of do it immediately, Sabrina, but we could follow up on it. Entirely your call.
All right.
We'll have a think actually across the piece. Thanks for that question. Just whether we package up the existing evaluations, because a couple of other evaluators have asked about that.
Elena, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, sorry, if no one else is sort of desperate to ask any questions. I was just wondering if the 2-year evaluation, apologies if you said this, maybe it's not clear. Are you thinking of getting a second cohort in the 2nd year? So you would have like 2 cohorts, or is the intervention, because it's only 10 weeks. So I assume that you would want a 2nd year to increase the sample size. Is that right?
If I understand your question correctly, so what we thought is that within those 2 years, we could actually increase the number of people we recruit on the program. But what we also saw from the application is that they have a very, very high demand anyway, and they also have many other locations where they implement being a parent alone. So what the applicants said in their application was that they will need 3 years to recruit the people only for the delivery of being a parent in positive leisure and sports. But if we combine it with other locations that are doing being a parent alone, there might be something to figure out there, but it's also not specified yet. So this will be something that we will explore together during the co-design phase. I don't know, Daniel, if you've got any views on this.
I mean, that sounds exactly right to me. I mean, just a wider point in case it's helpful to colleagues. I guess, you know, if you think about, we're 3 years into a 10-year fund, we have got to maintain a sense of urgency about the speed with which we're getting to impact findings, and that there's lots under the bonnet of that. But that's one of the reasons why I would sort of encourage teams to hold quite lightly the proposal from exactly how long and the number of sites that the project teams proposed. I think we've got to sort of take that really seriously and see that as the starting point. But I think we will be keen to explore through all of these whether it is possible that we focus on increasing the delivery if possible, to get to the say, whilst maintaining high fidelity quality delivery, not putting the project team under undue sort of pressure, to make sure that we're not sort of inadvertently decreasing the number of impact studies that we're able to do in what is a pretty limited amount of time.
That's really helpful, thanks.
Just going to have one final look and then we might push on. I think this might be me now, just covering for the couple of colleagues who aren't able to join us. So this is the one interparental conflict intervention that we have. So if you just keep going to the next slide. It is run by the Tavistock Centre for Couple Relationships, and it's a 10-week mentalisation-based therapy for parents experiencing high levels of interparental conflict. So, I mean, those of you familiar with this literature will know that the principles of mentalisation-based therapy have been applied to a few different contexts, and this is an interesting implementation that's been developed over the last few years, sort of specifically to look at the relationship between the parents with the goal of reducing conflict. It is for parents where conflict is frequent, intense and poorly resolved, and where that might be already leading to children showing signs of challenging behaviour. And again, like many of these, default assumption is that it will be those child level behavioural outcomes that are the primary outcome here. But again, sort of open to exploring that through the co-design process. It's sort of essential for YEF that it is a child level outcome. That's the primary outcome, but we do have an outcomes framework that we'll share with you shortly that helps us think through what the appropriate outcome might be for each of these trials. But until we get into that work, our default is that it will be a child level behavioural outcome measured by the SDQ. So I won't read this research question out loud. I was just going to make a wider point. You'll see we've tried at least, and we'd encourage evaluators to build on this, that really through the research question, what we're trying to do is get at the mechanisms that sit underneath the intervention, not for the main research question to be, is MST-CAN effective? Is MBT effective? I mean, that's an important question, but I think our worry and the worry of our grants and evaluation committee is that that doesn't lead to generalizable lessons, and that really we've got to be encouraging evaluators and projects to really get under the bonnet of what the mechanisms of the intervention are, to try and support that process of producing generalizable lessons. So as with all of these evaluations, we think best to sort of start with a pilot to be testing that process of randomization, before hopefully moving into the later phases of the study that look at the impact. I think the interesting thing about this in comparison to some of the other projects, it's where we get into this question of what is the amount of delivery that we really need to do in order to answer our primary research questions. So at the minute, the project partners, I think, have proposed working in, let me remind myself, a number of sites to reach a sample size of 360 over 3 years. We think that's probably a larger sample size than we need, although we sort of look forward to seeing evaluators' sample size calculations in the full proposals. And so this is the one I think where we would be keen, one of the ones where we're keen to do this in more like a year over those sites. But again, we'll work through the practicalities of that throughout the co-design phase. So if we just go to the next slide, please. Again, I think one of the things that's been really striking here, and I think this reflects the fact that of all the sectors YEF works with, this is probably one of the ones that's most used to approaches to evaluation that look at impact. And so again, this is another organisation that's really on board and indeed keen to do an RCT. They have quite a small sort of feasibility RCT already, and this work would be very much building on that. But again, one of the first things I think we need to do in co-design is really try and pinpoint what business as usual is and what the appropriate counterfactual would be, particularly given that there's some variation between the sites. Interesting questions about the best child level measure, as well as sort of thinking about this through an ecological perspective. What are the range of different outcomes that we need to capture that are relevant to this project's theory of change in order to answer those wider questions about the mechanism through which this intervention might be improving child outcomes. The other main challenges I think that we'll need to resolve as part of the co-design is that the number of sites needed, the balance of existing sites versus new sites in order to achieve the sample size, as well as just continuing to refine the referral pathways and the eligibility criteria. So just move on to the final slide on this one, please. Again, some similar themes here, but particularly keen to see bits from people who've got experience of working on impact evaluations, particularly RCTs on this one. Again, keen for subject matter expertise and experience of working on family-based interventions. Ideally with expertise of this sort of link on the interparental relationship. Recognising that that's an important part of the mechanism here. How that gets reflected in measurement as well. We've made some suggestions in the specs about the type of parent level outcomes that we might want to measure, but we have intentionally tried to give bidders a bit more freedom than we're able to do on the child level measures. So expertise on those parenting measures, I think, would also be welcome here, as would familiarity with the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. All right, that's enough from me on Tavistock. This might be one where people have got very detailed questions. We might just log them and come back to you once Chanel, who leads on this, is back. But I'm keen to have a first go if people have got questions on this one. Just check I'm not missing anything in the chat. Oh, it's just the journal article. Thanks for that, Sabrina. Having one last look. Do chip in, YEF colleagues, if you're worried I've missed anyone, but I'm not seeing any here. All right, Lucy, I might suggest we crack on to the final one then. So this is one of the suite of P programs that we've decided to shortlist. I think one of the things that I should say at the outset, and there'll be lots of people on the call who are way more expert than me on this. Obviously, there's a number of variants of P. It's grouped teen triple P that we're talking about here, level 4, I believe, where the proposal is that this is an intervention that's got an existing evidence base already. But the developers of triple P have done some early work in Australia where they're keen to see if they can adapt that to parents and foster carers of young people who've had adverse child experiences and are on or at the edge of care, where really our intention is, again, to look at child level behavioural outcomes. So we just keep going to the next slide. And so really the question that I think we're going to try and get at is really about the impact of those parenting practices that the triple P model is designed to enhance, their effectiveness of working with families of young people at the edge of care. Ideally, I think we would hope to get to an impact study, but I've got quite a bit more to say about the journey that we might get there on the next slide. If we do get to that impact study phase, we think if we assume that we're powered on the SDQ, we need about 206 families. And again, I think another intervention where we're going to need to allow for a reasonable amount of attrition. But given the delivery plans of the intervention team, maybe this is another one that we might do in 1 year. So if you just keep going, Lucy, thanks. So the thing that I just wanted to get across, I might jump straight to the point about the theory of change and the logic model. So if I just try and summarize where we got to when we presented this project with our committee, I'd see sort of lots of excitement about working with a cohort, I think, that cries out for the investment in further interventions and rigorous evaluations of those. But some nervousness about the plausibility of the theory of change of a 10-week parenting programme being adequate for this group of families and children. And so we proposed in the spec that to try and wrestle with those things, and inadvertently YEF spend quite a significant amount of public funding on an evaluation where we've not fully addressed whether the theory of change and the logic model is plausible for this target cohort, that we're going to divide the work into 2 phases. So the first phase is to really explore that adapted theory of change for this intervention with this new cohort, and just check that we're happy that the dose, that the eligibility criteria and other important facets of the logic model we think are plausible and should be tested in an impact study. And so we'll organise that as the first phase of the work, where an evaluator that we hope's got real expertise in these types of parenting interventions, as well as children that are at the edge of care, to really make sure that we've got a plausible theory of change and logic model here. That would sort of come as private advice to us that we'll reflect on, and then we'll make a decision about whether we proceed to the next phase of the study. And this is based on feedback actually that we received on our previous round, where broadly we have a pretty high success rate of projects that once we've sort of got to this point where we've made it to the short list, 9 out of the 10 projects in our previous round sort of made it through the co-design period and are now in the field. One of them didn't, and the advice that we had from the evaluator is we probably could have spotted quite early on that this wasn't a project that was quite ready yet. And so we're trying to take some of that learning here to really make sure we've taken a bit longer than we're able to do as a funder to really interrogate the theory of change and the logic model for this project before we start getting into looking at the impact of this adaptation in the UK context. So hope that background to this spec, which I think is written in slightly differently to the other ones, is helpful. I might leave it there for this one and see whether people have got sort of comments or questions on that approach. Tim, please.
Hi, Daniel. Tim here from Dartington Service Design. Yeah, thanks again for great intros. Just on just on this one with the really kind of kicking the tires of the sort of plausibility of the theory of change. Just so I'm clear, is that something that you'd anticipate being done as in the kind of co-design phase earlier on, or is it something that you would be sort of being commissioned as a substantive sort of evaluation research question. And the reason I ask that is, you know, I think to really kick the tires of this well, and it takes a reasonable amount of investment. And then secondly, sort of related question is, do you just want private advice around the plausibility of the theory of change, or do you want collaborative work with the developer to refine the theory of change and potentially aspects of the intervention to make it plausible if it's not? Yeah, so two-part question. Yeah,
I think we're pretty open-minded at this phase on that second point, Tim. And I think ideally, just because, you know, you'll know from our other work, just the pace that the committee structure that we've got creates in making sure that we can have agreement on our proposals, given that it meets fairly infrequently, that we would try and do this through our existing co-design process. But if it turned out that, you know, bidders thought really to do this well, the 1-2 sessions max that you've got allocated to looking at the theory of change isn't enough, I think we'd be open to having a rethink on that. You know, the goal here that you sort of alluded to is, can we really make sure that we're putting that effort in up front and not rushing to do an impact study too quickly for an intervention that might not be ready for that. I think the one thing that I would say is that if we decided we wanted to get into doing some iterative testing to make the theory of change plausible, which I guess could include things like increasing the dose, making some changes to the program content alongside the developer, I think we would be sort of in the market for exploring that. I think we would just need to sort of loop back to our committee and make sure that they were comfortable with that as well.
Great, thanks, Daniel. That's great.
No worries. You know, this is, I also have to sort of confess, this is a bit of a new way of working for us. We're sort of balancing. This doesn't feel like an intervention where we're close to the bottom of that 10 steps. I probably am conceptualizing this more as being up at the top. We've got an intervention that we know is effective, but we are making pretty significant changes to the theory of change and the logic model, and we just need to interrogate that before we commission any further work. Great. Just going to have one final look and then might push us on. I think we're looking good, Lucy, to keep going. Great. So I'm just going to build on a few points regarding budget, although sort of organically we have talked about most of what I'd planned to say. What I won't do here is sort of go into forensic detail about our entire approach to budget, mostly because at the point at which we request full proposals, we're going to share with you the budget guidance that we've developed in response to the common questions that we've had from evaluators about our approach. And we'll have the opportunity to sort of respond to any queries that you might have at the point at which you're developing proposals at that point. But broadly, if I say, you know, what is our goal as we interrogate budgets, really just trying to make sure that we've got expenditure that's proportionate to the aims and objectives of the evaluation, as well as the expenditure on the projects, recognising that we're funding both of those. And our committee is always interested to ask the question of whether the amount that we've got on evaluation is proportionate to the delivery costs, as well as it being firmly rooted within YEF's charitable status. For those of you who are getting a bit familiar with using our budget template, you'll be familiar that it divides things, broadly speaking, into two types of costs. So direct costs, where I think what we're really trying to look at and ask ourselves is, have we got, broadly speaking, what looks like an appropriate balance of staff allocation recognizing that on many of these evaluations, we're talking about needing a multidisciplinary team with senior input, of course, from PIs, but we might also have research assistants or associates involved. Just getting the balance of those types of staff we're sort of particularly keen on. Travel and subsistence can be charged as long as it's directly attributable to project work. I guess unlike the funders who work with full economic costing, we're a bit less keen on funding, say, for example, conference presentations, unless a really strong case can be made that it contributes directly to the success of the project. Ditto with equipment. Equipment can be charged to YEF projects, but just need a strong rationale that the work can't be executed without those. Another big driver of cost in our evaluations is just the cost of data collection and test administration. We sort of recognise that. I would expect to have sort of what I hope will be productive conversations, particularly on what's the scope and scale of implementation and process evaluation that we need to do a good job, recognising that really detailed, high quality, qualitative work needs to be balanced with sort of the costs and the budgets that we've got. Another thing that I would expect sort of to have some discussion with your evaluation manager is on test administration. We're really keen to make sure that we've got a robust approach to measurement without sort of strain into having too much test administration, particularly where that drives costs. I'm thinking things like IQ testing that need to be done by extremely well-trained researchers that need to be done face-to-face that can drive costs up. So it's not to say that these things are not possible, it's just to give you an indication of the things that we might have some back and forth about as we try and balance a portfolio of budgets that we take back to our committee. So on indirect costs, I've hinted at this already, that they can be included and include things like the cost of admin, personnel, finance, library services. After quite a lot of debate with people in the panel, we are trying to get to the point where these don't exceed 20% of the staff costs. That's pretty similar with other work centres and some other charitable funders. And again draws that distinction between us and other funders that are working with on full economic costing. I don't think we've got much wiggle room here, but if this is going to be a real problem for people throughout the commissioning process, sort of I'm keen to have conversations with people about what we might do here to ensure that that's not preventing people from bidding from YEF work. So I won't go into the details of these, but one of the things that we're trying to balance is there will be difference of views from different funders on this. I've become not super keen in just stating max budgets for various reasons, much more keen on ranges and encouraging evaluators to think through the costs within those ranges. And so broadly, I think the line that's important here is the third one, our impact studies, efficacy, effectiveness. These include the cost of the implementation and process evaluation. The average cost of the evaluations that we've funded in our previous round is about 380,000. And I would expect the majority of the evaluations in this portfolio to be within those ranges and sort of centering on that figure. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that evaluations over 500,000 are pretty exceptional, and I think will stay that way. And I would encourage evaluators, if they feel like an evaluation is sort of heading towards that end, that you discuss that with your assigned evaluation manager, just to avoid problems later on where we've got to have lots of budget negotiations, because getting agreement to budgets of that size is pretty tricky once I take those to our committee. So just want to be open with people about that. I guess those constraints that we've got on budgets, just I think highlights partly the reason why, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we were keen to explore a collaboration with NIHR on what I think are the two probably most complex projects that we've got in this portfolio, because obviously it means that for those evaluations, we are talking about fundamentally a different scale of budgeting that will be possible, increasing our chances of doing really rigorous evaluations. I still think good evaluations of those projects will be possible within the ranges here, but I think it's one of the reasons why we're keen to continue exploring that collaboration with NIHR. Great, I might leave it there on budgets, but expecting that we will have some conversations with people throughout the commissioning process once you've seen that guidance, but happy to take any burning questions on this now. Looking all good unless my YEF colleagues have spotted anything. All right, thanks everyone. We're on the homeward straight now. Lucy, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to say a few words on next steps after this. So we've already seen this diagram, which is a reminder of where we are in the process, but I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail now. So we're at the point of commissioning evaluations, which broadly is made up of 3 parts. So the first one we've already done, which is circulating the evaluation specifications to the panel. That's followed by an expression of interest phase, where interested evaluators will submit expressions of interest. And after that, we'll invite 2 to 3 evaluators per project to submit full evaluation proposals. And we may also conduct interviews with evaluators before appointing an evaluator to a project. So in a bit more detail, the expressions of interest, you'll have about 3 weeks to submit a 750-word expression of interest. And that will include outlining knowledge and experience of the research team, which is weighted at 50% in scoring, and methodological considerations, which is the other 50%. It will also need to include your approach to GDPR compliance and data protection. And our recommendation is to be focused and selective on the projects that you choose to bid for, and apply for evaluations that closely align with your experience, expertise, and interest. And I hope that came out in the presentations that colleagues gave earlier. And also make the EOI as closely focused on the project itself, rather than providing detailed background information on your organisation. And we'd discourage evaluators from submitting very similar expressions of interest for a lot of projects. And after that, you'll be invited to submit a full proposal. About 2 or 3 evaluators will be invited to do that. And those will be no more than 5,000 words. And in that, you'll include capability and relevant experience of the core project team, which is 40%, methodology and approach, which is 50%, and value for money. And then following evaluator appointment, we progress to the co-design phase, which we've mentioned a few times during this presentation. So we'll go into a little bit more detail on that now, but we do actually have another upcoming workshop on the 27th of April, where we'll go through this in more detail. And that's particularly for evaluators who haven't worked with YEF previously. So during the co-design and setup period, you will have an opportunity to, as evaluators, to work closely with the project team and alongside YEF to produce a final project and evaluation proposal that will go to YEF's grants and evaluation committee. And that will be the final proposal that will be considered by the grants and evaluation committee and finally approved, or not approved. But as Daniel said previously, we hope and expect that the vast majority will be approved by that point. And co-design provides an opportunity to develop and refine both the project and the evaluation in partnership with each other. So it's really an opportunity to work closely together, make sure that everybody is clear and on board with the plan. And as you'll know and can imagine, that will involve quite a lot of feedback, discussion, some compromise, balancing the needs of both the project and the evaluation with each other. And there'll need to be strong understanding amongst all partners and strong communication as well. And as well as the co-design meetings that everyone will have, which will be at least 3, it will also be important that you work with the project team in between those meetings in most cases. For example, it might involve additional work on the theory of change or exploring methodological considerations. And a key part of the co-design process will be determining exactly what will be delivered and how it will be evaluated. So as we've said before, sometimes that might involve refining what is delivered and also refining the evaluation plans that were submitted in the full proposal. And just moving on now to the final joint proposal. So this is the proposal that will be developed during the co-design period and then submitted to the grants and evaluation committee. That will give an overview of the project, budget and timeline, the evaluation, which might have been updated since the full proposal was submitted. So the evaluator will lead on the evaluation side of things, but both the project and the evaluators will work on the project and evaluation implementation plan, which is the final element of it. So that's really a whistle-stop tour of what comes next. But as I mentioned, there will be another workshop taking place on the 27th of April from 10 till 12. Hopefully some of you have got that in your diary. And we would encourage evaluators who are interested in bidding for this grant round and haven't worked with YEF before to join that workshop, because we'll give more detail on our approach to evaluation, including co-design. We'll talk about outcome data collection, our data archive, cost process and evaluation, for example. However, existing evaluators who have already worked with us, conscious that you will all be very busy and have time constraints. So it isn't essential that you attend this workshop, but you're also very welcome if you want a refresher. And also some of our processes have been slightly updated. So we'd encourage you to join if you'd like to as well. And we'll send an invite to everyone who has attended this workshop, and feel free to forward that on to colleagues. And in terms of timeline and next steps, and looping back to a question that was asked previously, here is a bit more detail on the intended timeline for the co-design period and final proposals. And we've separated this into 2, ones that where we're planning to explore a collaboration with NIHR, which you can see now. So this is for MSTcan and NSPCC. And the goal of this timeline is to ensure that you're ready to submit the proposal to NIHR in August. So compared to the timings that I'll show you in a moment, this is slightly condensed. And we will circulate these slides afterwards so you've got it. And then these are the planned timings for the other projects where we're not exploring a collaboration with NIHR. So you can see that you've got slightly more time for those. Thanks very much, everybody, and I hope that was a useful overview. And I did just want to pause for final questions on that or anything else that we've gone through today. Nikki, go ahead.
Okay, so if I've understood it correctly, you're thinking in terms of contracts being signed and work starting up sort of September, October?
Yes, let me just go back to the timeline. So that's in terms of submitting the final proposal, that would be towards the end of September, at least for the ones that wouldn't be NIHR. But actually after that, it would then go to the Grants and Evaluation Committee meeting, which would take place beginning of October, and then contracts would be signed around October time. Yeah, and then there would be a period of writing protocols, going through NHS ethics. So it's likely that the data collection wouldn't start until the end of 2022 or possibly early 2023.
Okay, and for the other two studies?
That is where we are less clear on the exact timings that would take place, because it would be dictated by NIHR's processes once that application has been submitted to NIHR. But I don't know if Daniel or Ali, you've got anything to add on those.
Yeah, I can add a little bit of information. The NIHR, their process is also a two-stage process. So, and yeah, as Lucy has said, we don't have exact dates for that, but looking at their April fund and what the dates are for that, I think were evaluators not successful at stage 1, that we would probably know that by late October. So I think it will be slightly behind the others. So a slight situation of the co-design being slightly ahead of the others and condensed, and then the timelines beyond that being slightly longer, where I think if evaluators are successful and go through to stage 2, then we're probably looking at spring 23 before those, before we're looking at evaluation agreements and work starting.
Okay, but have I understood it correctly that YEF funding is not predicated on success with NIHR funding? Because obviously it'd be really irritating if people were to go to all the trouble of putting in an application to the YEF and then didn't proceed because they didn't get NIHR funding.
Yeah. That's exactly right, Nikki. That's why we've been keen to front load our own commissioning processes now, to avoid the clunkiness later of us not being in a position where we're clear we've been through our own due diligence if the NIHR process isn't successful. Now, there's a couple of wrinkles to that, though, that, as you've asked, I'll mention now, even though some of this we can get into with the shortlisted bidders. There are a couple of things that NIHR, I think, expect for definitive trials that I think within the resources that we've got available, we're going to find difficult. And so two that occur to me is the pretty intensive involvement of clinical trials units, as I understand it, and the other is a full cost effectiveness study. And so I think there will be a process of readjustment, I think, to make sure that we've got a study that we can run realistically within our constraints. But the commitment is that once we've got agreement from our committee that this is a project that we want to fund, then we'll go ahead and do that regardless of the outcome of the NIHR funding.
Okay, I can see it's complicated. I'm sorry for being croaky. Can I add another complicated money question, which sort of also brings in the NIHR? So you fund delivery costs for the project concerned, but you're also very keen in, I think, nearly all your projects to use an RCT design, and that does raise the possibility of another sort of intervention, because for children and young people, leaving them on waiting lists forever isn't very comfortable or ethical. So are you expecting that any alternative or comparative intervention will be provided by the project and through the funding you give them? Is there any alternative funding, really, is what I'm asking, for your comparison arms?
Yeah, great question. I think the default position would be that ideally we prefer it if there's something already in the system that we're comparing the YEF intervention to. There have been a couple of cases where in the process of developing the ethics application, the researchers have been a bit worried about that, about what would be happening otherwise. And we have ended up with what you might call an active control, where it's either a shorter version of the intervention or something else that the organisation's in a position to offer. And in those cases where essentially we've come to the conclusion that there isn't anything happening in the system that would make a good counterfactual, we have funded those.
Okay,
yeah.
And they come from the project?
In the two cases that where we've done this, they have come from the project. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you know, recognizing that ethics is a process and sort of reasonable people are going to disagree about bits of it. I guess we are keen to just interrogate some of the assumptions that, you know, projects and evaluators might have about ethics, because often we're making the decision to fund this project because we don't know whether it's effective or not. And so, you know, we expect just open discussion between us as the funder project and the evaluator in, you know, what does it mean to do an ethical evaluation of this intervention in this context, and, you know, just look forward to working with teams on that. And making sure that we've got, you know, an approach to ethics that's fit for purpose for each of those projects. That's why through the panel review process, we've sort of looked quite a bit at the ethics approaches of each of the organisations to make sure that we've got a review function that's independent of the delivery team.
Okay, thanks.
Unless you can spot any, Lucy, I think it looks like we might be all okay. Great.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can't spot any.
All right, I might draw us to a close. You know, I hope this has been helpful. Our goal really is sort of to help teams be in the best position that they can to put in bids with us, but we're always really open and responsive to feedback about how we can improve these sessions. I hope that, particularly for those of you working with us for the first time, you'll find that we're a pretty open and responsive funder. And so if you did want to have a conversation with us following this meeting about any of these projects, that's an offer that we'd make to all teams in the interest of fairness. So do get in touch if in doing the EOIs, but I guess particularly the proposals, that it's raised other issues for you that you'd like to discuss with us. We're always keen to do that to make sure that we're using making the best use of everybody's time and resources. I can't see any hands going up, so in that case I might wish everybody a happy and productive week and hopefully look forward to working with many of you in the future. All right, take care everyone. Bye for now.